Today I'm going to show you how I went from this to this. We're going to cover how you can create these hand-drawn animation scenes inside of Blender using grease pencil and some 3D scenes with some clever shading. So for one, you can see here we get real-time playback inside of Eevee. This is a super fun way to edit your 2D style scenes with some hand-drawn character animations, bringing this whole thing together. There's a lot of atmospheric effects that we can do and different things we can do right inside the 3D scene that all blend really nicely. And I'll show you, I'll break this down for you. So the way that I started was, I actually started before the character was drawn. I had this reference. I mocked up this animation with a super basic 3D character so that I could create the camera path, right? That's the most important thing, because if you want to blend this 2D character with the 3D scene, you're going to want to know how the perspective is supposed to change, because you can see on the 2D scene, there's a big dynamic perspective. You got the spinning camera, right? And you're going to want to match those up. If you haven't planned it out in advance, it's going to be a huge pain to line up how the perspective of the 2D scene with the perspective of the 3D camera. Obviously, if you're just doing shots from one side of a character without any movement or whatnot, or just some basic panning, that's easier. But if you want to do big dynamic shots like this planning stage is super, super helpful for being able to know exactly how the camera is supposed to move. And so this is the reference that I gave to our character animator. And then I was able to have this 2D animation along with these effect layers that I brought in. And the way that I brought this in was it's basically just projected onto a plane, right? So this is our plane here with our little firebender. It's being projected from that first camera. So this is the first camera that I started with the reference camera animation. And I'm projecting that onto this plane. You might have to, this is via a UV project modifier. You might have to adjust the aspect ratio, to get this right. But then what I did was, this is just on a principled BSDF, right? So this is a super simple material. Plug in your color from your video and your alpha, and that's it. You might want to do emission if you're trying to get the colors exact from the animation. But what I like about not doing an emissive texture is that you begin to get some of the lighting from the scene, right? And it's not like there's no depth to it because it's still lighting on a flat plane. So it can't account for like the depth of the character's arms or things like that. But you can see kind of as we turn towards the light source, this really does help the character feel integrated. You can start to see the shadow behind the character and the light on the character. It feels really integrated in the scene because you can see the light from the 3D scene impacting the character. So that's really cool. That's why I like just doing, straight principled BSDF here with no emission. And then from there, what I did was I actually created a new camera. And this allows me, for one, if I start messing around with this first camera, I'm messing around with the projection, and I don't want to do that. So I created a new camera that's parented to the first camera, and that's where I add, for one, I pull in a little tighter so that we don't end up seeing any of this clipping on the outside. And I also added a bunch of camera shake here, and I'll show you in the graph editor. Basically what we did is on some of these rotation points, we go to our modifiers in the graph editor, and I added 2 layers of noise, right? So the first layer of noise is just kind of general camera shake, right, throughout. The second one, I restricted the frame range, and it's a higher strength noise with a lower scale so that it's more impactful. It's really heavy, right? And that is only hitting during these tiny little ranges when there's like an impact, right? So when he does this little kick, boom, there's a big shake there. And same thing at the beginning when he does this flame right there. So each of these has an actual impact on the camera shake. So that's where that second noise layer comes in. But that allows me, so I can do that on this second camera, add these, keyframe the rotation on these different areas and add these noise modifiers to get that camera shake. So that's what that is. Then from there, the way that we start building out this scene, so we have our character in, I have the effects on a separate layer here, but it's the exact same process. For this one, I actually did use the emissive texture because it's fire. It's supposed to glow a little bit, and that'll allow us to add some bloom on that in the compositing. Then, to start build out this scene, I'll turn off some of these layers so we can see it more easily, turn off our volumetrics. I pulled this geometry out of Megascans, so this is all like really nice, geometry for rocks and the different terrain, but these are all straight out of Megascans. And all I did here for the shader, this is like pretty darn simple, was I have a principal BSDF, a shader to RGB node, and plug that into a color ramp with your three, your shadow, your typical color, and your highlights, right? And I've set this to constant so that they're not blending at all. You get this kind of like really classic cell shaded look. And there's a bunch of tutorials for doing different styles of cell shading in Blender. But this allows us, again, to get some like interaction with the sunlight. So you have some lighting in the scene that makes sense. And it's a super basic shader that's just on each of these geometries out of Megascans. So that part is pretty easy. I pulled in some like cloud textures here just to add some volume and movement in the background. And then to get the line art on this background stuff, we're using a grease pencil object, and it is the collection line art. So what this is going to do, I can show you. I'll turn these off so you can see. We'll create a collection line art, and this is going to add line art onto a specific collection, right? So this is in the modifiers panel, and we'll go over to pick which collection the line art is applying to. We'll say foreground because I have these objects grouped based off of what's in the foreground. And then we're going to turn down the thickness for one. And you can create a different line material if you need to. I'm just going with some basic black lines. But then you also get to choose what kind of edge type you want. Now, this is also only going to make sense from the camera view. So we'll switch to the camera view. It's because it's projecting those lines from the camera. Then we're going to go to edge types, and I'm going to turn off intersections. You have a bunch of different options here for different edge marks that you want. Material borders, so if you have different materials on an object, you can put a line in between those material borders. And you can change whether this is the silhouette of the object or the contours of the object. But I'm going to turn off intersections so that this intersection with the ground is not highlighted, so these blend a little bit better. And I'm going to turn down the overall thickness. And then what you can do is you can add a modifier on top of this called noise. And right now it's just adding noise to the position of the lines, which we don't want. I'm going to turn that off and add some noise to the thickness. So this way we get varying line weights, which is just going to look a little bit more like hand-drawn lines, right? So this versus this is more uniform. This adds some variation to the thickness, and you can tweak these settings so that you can add noise to the strength, to these different elements. And then you can also tweak the noise scale, and that's going to dictate how big your noise is. And I lean towards a little bigger and maybe a little stronger, so that we get these more smooth transitions. If the noise scale is really tiny, you're going to get lots of little variations. Bigger scale means it's going to be larger variation, so a more smooth gradient between thick and thin. And we can turn this up a little bit, maybe 0.6. So that's how you get the lines on there. Now the problem is going to be, and you can set up the different lines for your foreground, midground, and background elements and just put those into different collections. The problem is once I bring back in my character, those lines are gone. And that's because they're getting occluded by this transparent frame. So the way that I dealt with that, I'm still new to some of these grease pencil tools. There may be something in this occlusion setting where you can draw these even when there's an object in front, but I don't know how to do that without getting the lines just on top of everything that is occluding it. So I just set up different view layers so that we have, a layer for the background, a layer for the line art to go on top of everything, a layer for the character, which also includes some of our particle effects, and a layer for the character effects, and then just one for the world. So I could drop this into the background. So I rendered this separately, and I can show you some of the compositing, but let's first go through some of the effects. Now that you have your character in the scene and you have some line art on your scene, one of the cool things about this workflow is that we can add these effects, right? So we can add in some volumetrics. We've got some dust in here as well to just make the scene more dynamic. But again, what's cool about bringing your 2D character into this 3D scene is all of this stuff is now going to interact. You're going to have a three-dimensional feel. It blends the character into the scene more. So you've got particles behind the character and in front of the character. And the way that I did that, so we have these volumetric clouds. This is really stupid simple. If we look at the material for this, it's just a volume scatter with a color ramp plugged into the density and noise plugged into the color ramp. All we had to do to animate it was to animate the Y location of these volumetrics. So that immediately kind of gives the scene this more atmospheric element to it. And you've got stuff in front of the character, behind the character. It just gives it some nice movement and life. Then the last thing that I did was I added this little dust emitter over here. And this is just a super simple particle system with these tiny little dust pieces. And what this does is if you add some motion blur to this, you don't need much geometry to really make this feel, like a live scene. And you've got particles going in front of the character and behind the character, and it just starts to blend everything together. So the compositing is super simple in this. All I really did was I just have these render layers set up for the background, character, effects, and the different elements. And the only really compositing I did inside Blender was basically to combine the different character elements. So for instance, I took the effects, added a blur node, and screened that on top of the character layer just to add some of that light onto him. And then alpha overed that with a glared version of the effects to combine these here. And each of these just went to basically a different render sequence inside of our file output. And then I just composite those in After Effects. Bada bing, bada boom. It's pretty simple. And here you have your beautiful 2D character scene inside of Blender. I love this workflow with Grease Pencil, with 2D characters inside of 3D scenes. It really gives a lot of flexibility, making these things really feel immersive, adding a lot of depth to your 2D scenes. Let me know if you like this, if it's helpful. Like the video, subscribe, and drop your comments if you have questions on this workflow or other things you'd like to see around this. And I'll see you in the next one.